Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to talk about the Season 2 dungeon pool and how good and possibly bad some of these dungeons are going to be onto this one. Keep in mind, the dungeons that we are going to be going into is Cinderbrew Meadery, Darkflame Cleft, The Rookery, Priory, Sacred Flame. These are all the dungeons we had at the start of the expansion for our heroic spams. Then they are going to be bringing in a new dungeon called Operation Floodgate. Then the Motherlode from BFA, Mechagon Workshop from BFA, and Theater of Pain onto this one. So let's start it off with the one on everyone's mind. Certainly is on mine. Darkflame Cleft. This dungeon has some really cool boss fights and then some really awful trash packs. The first things I'm thinking about in a high key environment, and even just like a regular environment, is gonna be how the heck are you gonna be start juicing up the minecart at the end when you have to run around in the dark and you do 0 damage whatsoever when you're outside of the candlelight room. So basically, somebody has to go outside a line of sight to grab more candle juice, to feed it into the cart, to keep it moving, while also pulling mobs. And when you're pulling mobs, you do no damage or healing. So how the hell is a tank gonna survive that and mitigate the damage, stay alive, bring it back to the candle? I have no idea on that one. On the bright side, though, I think that there is going to be some interesting boss fights, particularly the Candle King, I think could be quite good, as we had the appearance, at least, of a rot ticking fight. When the candle wax figurines that the boss creates, you have to kill these off with a throw from the boss, and that starts reducing some of the ticking damage. I'm really curious if this could be closer to a Khajiit steady damage fight. That I'm at least excited to be able to see. Some of these other fights seem kind of just like a survive or die, pass fail kind of thing. The Darkness, for example, with a lot of party-wide buster damage, seems almost akin to the first boss of Grim Batol, where it's okay, do you use defensive, you live. Do you not use defensive, you don't live. Something along those lines. So Darkflame Cleft, maybe a C right now. If they do something good that makes it way less tedious for the candles, or they make it some kind of way that the tank has a perma candle on them or something, so they can actually pull a bunch of mobs, this could be better. But top of my list for some of the concerns. Cinderbrew Meadery, I also have quite a few concerns on this dungeon. It's going to be amazing for big pulls. It's going to be amazing Algathar Academy first room type of stuff to just sort of rally everything together. But at the same time, there's an absurd amount of casters and big spike damage on targets. If you ever got double tap by Throw Flesh and Necrotic Wake, that's what I'm talking about there. You have these meadery guys on the right side wing as you're going towards the B boss, that these guys are just gonna mass slow everybody. And then you have the just giant AoE stomp that you're not going to be able to get your way out of if you're already slowed. So the importance on kicks there feels really absurdly high. And in that B wing, you also have the bees with a final sting, which can just destroy somebody if it's not crowd controlled. So I think some of these mechanics could just be really obscenely overtuned if they're not careful about it. And that's where I'm very concerned about that area. Same thing goes for some of the meadery canisters on the IPA side of the boss wing, I guess you could say. Those, if they have too much health as they start scaling into higher key levels, could be really tedious. Same thing as the totems at the end of Stone Vault. You know how many times those go off, just start killing everybody? My hope is that they make those totems super easy to kill, to just vaporize, so everyone can have fun and just focus on the DPS aspect. Boss-wise, I am pretty excited about the encounters. First boss of the Brewmaster is going to have not really a whole lot of damage going on, but when there is, it's ticking damage. The rest of the group actually has to do mechanics while the healer can just blast healing. The IPA fight looks like there's good bursts of damage, and then you kind of kite and move around. Not anything too crazy challenging. The Mounted Bee boss, whatever his name is, has some fun knockbacks on hand. So the damage patterns for these fights look pretty cool. The last boss, the BEO, I think that one will be pretty standard, pretty safe. You just blast some single target healing into the players that are detonating some of the barrels, and then you just kind of add some damage. Not anything super stressful from the healing department, but I'm really worried about some of those trash packs on hand. Okay, now let's talk about Priory. Priory has the potential to be the best dungeon of this entire pool, okay? I know there's absurd amounts of mobs and there's an absurd amount of casters, but we've already seen in a couple dungeons, I would even liken it to sort of Stone Vault, where there are those like alloy bolts that some of the guys are casting as you're going to the machinist speaker wing. Those guys do like a little bit of damage, and obviously if you get like quadruple tapped, you die, but the damage is like not nearly as high as some of the other bolts type cast you would see in the rest of the Season 1 dungeon pool. If they have things tuned like that, where like it's just gonna be some damage randomly on everybody, but everyone's kind of taking the same amount of damage for it, plus you're gonna have like ticking damage out of like the mini boss leading up to the Prioress, and there's just some of the other mini bosses for leading up to like the first boss, like his lieutenants for the sergeant at the beginning, there's a good chance there's a high amount of unavoidable damage, which could make it really engaging from a healer side, while the damage dealers get to run around and just do as much damage as they can and like AoE everything down all over the place. This has a really high potential to be an insanely fun dungeon. Everything is going to be humanoid, which is really good for skipping around some of those areas thanks to Mind Soothe. It's also easier to shroud, sap, crowd control, all those other guys, so you don't have to worry about some of the like undead requirements that some specs are going to have for what they can and cannot crowd control. So I think Priory has some really cool options, especially when it comes to just route variety and what options that you're going to have on hand. Boss fight wise, I think the first encounter is going to be really interesting to see how many like lieutenants you can actually deal with at a higher key level, what people are going to try to replicate on that one. I hope that there's like a hard limit where you can like only really deal with like 2 at a time or something, because if you've played in Theater of Pain, we'll talk about that in a sec, there's those moments where like if you tried to fight all 3 at once in pugs, you could just instantly die depending on the combination that you were fighting and just how well people were dealing with things, having enrages, enough kicks, you know, the works. So I hope that there's going to be like a hard limitation they have from their own tuning, so that it's, hey, you can only have the boss and like 1 lieutenant and that'll be killable. You can do 3 if you're, you know, max geared, crazy MDI gear doing like 10s, you know, something to dissuade people from trying to do some of those bozo type pulls. Boss fight wise, I'm really excited and I'm really hopeful that there's going to be like a greater amount of ticking damage in Priory. We'll have to see, since a lot of the damage mechanics we kind of steamrolled at like a normal and a heroic level. There was some good pulsing damage out of the Prioress at the end of the instance, but not as much rot as I was really hoping for. We'll also have to see how much those ads are going to annihilate the tanks going into the next season as well, but I'm very excited on the side of Priory. Let's talk about Workshop before we get to the other ones. Workshop is going to be crazy fun. I'm not a huge fan of them bringing it back, and this is going to be the 3rd iteration that we have of Workshop, but to be fair, it is a very good dungeon. Not only are the boss fights going to be very fun in terms of everyone kind of having to do mechanics and having to work together, both for the brawlhalla that you're getting into at the very beginning of the instance, ramming the machines into like the right hammers. The pulsing damage is going to be really fun to be healing, and how you kind of adjust your positioning. The dog boss is actually very fun. I don't think they're ever going to do anything about the line of sight positioning, so you still will have that like sneaky spot where you can plant your feet and start casting. But most of all, I'm very excited for some mind control tech coming back. If you didn't play back then, you could have priests in your group mind control one of the tinkerers, and they deploy this mechanical squirrel, and the mechanical squirrel like explodes after a brief period of time. And so you could be doing as much damage as a DPS, as a healer, by just mind controlling these guys and setting off these insane squirrels. If you micromanaged it properly, it would make the dungeon so obscenely easy. It was very fun to be able to play with. The dungeons just overall have a lot of cool things to dodge, a lot of cool things to fight. You do have to be careful in the garden section, because there's a lot of things that like wombo combo people and sort of kill them off in pugs, but it's so much avoidable damage that is one of those things that like the healer's only gonna be able to do so much, and so people have to kind of like do their own jobs. The last boss with King Mechagon is obscenely fun to heal. You have both like pulse damage, you also have prio target healing that you have to be putting out, and there is a good amount of movement, but again, if you're able to adjust your position properly, it's a very fun fight. Pretty much the entire instance has really cool ways that like, even if you're in pug groups where people are like taking all kinds of damage, you control your own positioning well. If you play well, you're more easily able to sort of like muscle heal through other people having problems. And that gives you a lot more agency as a healer, rather than people just randomly poof and dying because like ad cast or something like that going on. Same thing goes for some of the trash packs where they're having some like the mass AoE. You also have some of the big shields you can take advantage of to stand in for additional DR as you're killing off some of them. So I'm really excited that Workshop's coming back. Even though I'm a little disappointed that it's repeating, I am glad that they're at least repeating a dungeon, which is really, really good. Motherlode, I'm incredibly concerned about going into the new season. I think Motherlode was one of my favorite dungeons back in VFA, in large part for the huge pulls that you could do. In a lot of cases, there was some good unavoidable damage from some of the mechs or mini bosses that you just had to heal through, and there were some very skillful tools that you could have both in like outranging certain mechanics, forcing mechanics to go onto like the tank, making sure that there were certain areas where you just had to like blast healing to actually survive. That being said, Blizzard's made a lot of changes to legacy dungeons, and not always in the best of ways. Motherlode was historically famous for doing like 80 or 90% of your enemy forces before the second boss. You would just round up all kinds of mobs, kill off everything really quickly, and you'd be almost done with enemy forces, which meant you would go in, kill the second boss, and in Season 4, you would take advantage of awakening skips that we had, one of the best affixes that we ever had. But even before that, high key groups would basically be using rogue shrouds or death skips, really, to make sure that they were skipping all of this additional trash percentage. Now, obviously, we have the Challenger's Peril, which is going to be having the 15-second death penalty, so you can't really do that. But also, I would not be shocked if they were going to make more changes, just like they made changes in Dragonflight to how the True Sight mechanics are working, so you can't mind sue those targets that have True Sight on them. I would not be shocked if they start reorienting the positioning of some of these mobs. I hope they don't, but I have a feeling that they're going to prevent death skips from happening, which would mean you can't do as big of pulls at the beginning of the instance because you'd need to continue pulling mobs later on because they would do something to stop some of these like mass pulls or something to stop like the death skips from the third boss into the fourth boss. The fourth boss wing is really rough because you're fighting up a hill as artillery fire is coming down onto your group, and all you can really pull are just massive mechs that deal tons of damage. So I don't know what exactly they're going to be doing on that end, but at least the boss fights are going to be looking pretty fun, or at least they were last time around. The Rockmora type boss that you had, you would basically be using like totems to stun some of his minions, and you'd be like killing them off before they could cause everybody to earthquake, so there was fun pulsing damage. You kind of had like a boring boss with, I think it's called Rixa Fluxflame. That third boss would basically put out debuffs, almost similar to what you had out of the last boss of Borealis, except there's not as much burst. It would just be this massive heavy dot. I guess you could think about it as the second to last boss in Arakara, that big beetle. Big ticking damage. You have to be dispelling and smashing healing through those targets that are getting them and just kind of readjusting your positioning. So not super engaging when it comes into the healing mechanics, which is something I hope they do change, but I'm also a little bit concerned about how they're going to change some of those trash mechanics to prevent skips. We'll see. Very excited to see what Floodgate is going to have. On the side of fixing up boss fights, this one is going to be really interesting because we're not going to have a lot of turnaround time. It's a brand new dungeon that we're going to probably test in PTR, and then it's going straight into the M+ pool. So I hope they spend a lot of time working onto that one. Theater Pain's gotten a lot of work over the years. Notably, Theater has had, an entirety of Shadowlands with a little bit of iteration, a little bit of adjustments. They've done a lot of things, especially for like the Council of Champions at the beginning to make it way less irritating to fight, especially like the Rogue. I think they got rid of it entirely in like Season 4, if I'm not mistaken. Let me know if I'm wrong on that one. With that being said, I'm a little bit worried about a couple different pieces of it. Enrages have not been a really huge part of the dungeon pool in the War Within thus far. There have been a few, but it's not like dispel the enrage or die the way we had them back in Shadowlands. That's really prominent in Theater of Pain. There's a lot of disease dispels you have to worry about in that dungeon. One thing I mentioned is there hasn't been a whole bunch of like variety with like poisons, notably in this dungeon pool, which is great. There are a couple of like disease-oriented dispels, but they're not like the end of the world going into Theater of Pain. I am enormously concerned about Zav the Unfallen, the Unbroken, where basically he would spawn these banners that would slow players, and at high enough key levels, it just got insane how much health that they had to break them and then be able to actually move again, because all the rest of the fight was survive a smash on the ground, dodge frontals, cones, all that other stuff, kill a banner. Very simple, very basic. DPS players would duel each other, bash each other's brains out for a damage buff. Huzzah. But man, oh man, was it tedious having to fight that boss with banners that just are increasing in health with the key level. There's been so many dungeons over the years. The final boss of Brackenide Hollow, notably with the totems. Vortex Pinnacle with those little spark ads that you had to fight off as well. So many different instances over the years with these little priority ads that scale up with the dungeons that are super unfun to fight. So I hope that they at least keep that in mind going forward, because I'm not looking forward to fighting something like that, or just having to do like race changes just to actually get out of some of these slow mechanics or something like that. I don't know. Capping it off, I am super stoked about the Rookery, notably because I think some of the instance is going to be really fun for all of the unavoidable damage to heal. You can not only do really big pulls and even have vulnerability windows if you're a DPS player. At the end of the instance, you can actually get some of the mobs stunned by the circling Storm Rider. He kind of like stuns every mob. And also if you break some of the shields, it makes them take more damage. So there's a lot of skill in terms of how you're setting up your damage. But there's also a lot of these void mobs which are pulsing lots of AoE and making trash packs a lot more interesting from a healer side, where people don't just poof instantly to miss kicks, but there's actually mechanics you have to prepare for to deal with. I think Dawnbreaker is probably the best example, or the best sort of like parallel to that, in that trash packs would deal a lot of damage, but people don't just randomly evaporate from a lot of them. There's like Night Bolts in Dawnbreaker that can kind of come to mind, but I'm hoping, and that's going to be like the major point of my feedback, that they don't have those crazy high bolt damage or anything like that in the Rookery, because this one, in addition to Priory, could be like easily the top 2 dungeons of the pool, if not some of the top dungeons of the expansion, as a result of some of those timings. I do want to see them add more ticking damage kind of across the board to these boss fights, because there's a lot of like just burst AoE in all the season 1 dungeons, where it's like, okay, like this is Disc's bread and butter, feels great to heal as Disc, but you know, what about everybody else? Some healers have really good steady healing profiles, which benefit massively from boss fights like Khajiit if you played it in Halls of Infusion and Dragonflight, where it's just steady damage the entire fight, ticking down. You have to continuously heal up that rot damage. We haven't really had much of that in the War Within Season 1, and so even if they have to make some changes, which sometimes they do, going into these new seasons, I hope that they start considering just kind of spicing up a little bit of the healing challenges that we have going into this next season. But let me know what you guys think. What are the dungeons that are most horrifying for you going into the new one? And what do you think some changes they're going to make to Motherlode in particular? Let me know. Huge thank you to our patrons for making all this content possible. And if you're enjoying this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.